B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Monday, October 5th, 2020. Well, CoviDon's has launched his latest reality show. I suggest the working title, SuperHuman. Or maybe Invincible. So, yesterday I had the TV on and I was reading the Sunday papers and I got word that the Don had decided that he was going to take a little ride outside of Walter Reed Hospital. And before that, he issued a tweet to his fawning cultists, telling them how great he feels, how he has learned so much about COVID. He's gotten an education, and not just the book education. And in part of the video, he said, I get it. And then he teased his minions and said, have I got a surprise for you? So then, defying at least all of the outside experts, he hopped in a presidential limousine. It's a big, SUV, not the Beast. I'm not sure why they didn't have the Beast at the hospital for him, but whatever. And in this huge Chevy Suburban, there are two Secret Service agents in the front seat driving him on this little outing and providing, I suppose, security. There was an SUV in front of them and one behind. And so Trump took this opportunity to wave to his fans who had congregated outside the Walter Reed Military Medical Center in Bethesda, Maryland. And my first reaction was I could see through the windows of the SUV that at least the agent in the passenger seat was wearing a plastic PPE gown. I also saw he had a plexiglass visor, and he was clearly wearing a surgical mask. And the idea that somebody who has an active infection of COVID-19 SARS-2 was gallivanting around, and we later learned that this vehicle is hardened for biological agents, and so it is a sealed compartment. And I pity those Secret Service agents. They should get combat pay. They should have been wearing hazmat suits. There should have been one of those plexiglass dividers, bulletproof, between the front seats and the rear. I didn't see that. And what was it that drove Donald Trump to leave his sickbed and go out for this little afternoon drive? He needed to refill his narcissistic supply. He needed to feel important, indispensable to the minority but hardline base that supports him. And I want to thank Ford Green, who's a daily listener to this podcast, and Dr. Justin Frank, the psychiatrist from Washington who wrote Trump on the Couch, for explaining the deep need of a narcissist for this supply of adulation. And when I first saw he was leaving Walter Reed, I thought, well, gosh, is he running out to get some toothpaste? He doesn't drink, so he's not going for a bottle of booze. He doesn't smoke, so it's not that he's out of cigarettes. And he could have sent an underling for any of those kinds of tasks. But no substitute could supply Trump with his desperate need for the love of those people whom he disparages and puts down on a regular basis. He's glad he doesn't have to shake hands with any of these disgusting people anymore. So this has led to a lot of outrage. We'll get to that in a moment. But as always, Trump manages to upstage yesterday's outrage with today's outrage. And so this morning, apparently hopped up on the steroids that they're feeding him, he took to Twitter, and we'll get to some of his other tweets here in just a bit. But the critical one was he notified his loyal devotees, I will be leaving the great Walter Reed Medical Center today at 6:30 p.m., feeling really good. Now, number one, the Secret Service has to be really pissed that he gave a location and a time of when he will be in motion. And I'll just leave it to your imagination about what opportunities or risks that kind of information presents. And Trump tweeted on, don't be afraid of COVID. Don't let it dominate your life. We have developed under the Trump administration some really great drugs and knowledge. I feel better than I did 20 years ago. So COVID drugs are the fountain of youth for this guy? And I haven't heard him comment or commiserate with Kayleigh McEnany, his frontline liar, press secretary, spin mistress, because she and two members of her communications office both reported this morning that they have tested positive for the coronavirus. Now, the doctor, who is Trump's official doctor, his name is Sean Conley, and while Dr. Fauci says he's qualified, he is an osteopath. And one wag on Facebook said, does that make him an osteopathological liar? He's given widely varying reports on the president's condition. He screwed up the timeline and had to correct himself. He apologized for overly optimistic statements. And after his Saturday performance, Mark Meadows, the White House chief of staff, felt compelled to brief the media. He attempted to do it off the record, but he kind of blew the routine there, and he was quickly outed. But he said, well, you know, it's the president's illness is serious. And he referenced that on Friday they'd had to put Trump on oxygen. Dr. Conley danced around the oxygen question clearly because he knows that Trump is sensitive about any suggestion that his health is less than robust. So the idea that Trump could be discharged this evening, and it's 3:30 Pacific time, that's 6:30 Eastern. This is the point when he announced he would be leaving Walter Reed. And I don't have any confirmation. I'm in the booth and talking to you, so I don't know if the movement is actually underway. But this idea was astonishing to outside experts, and candidly, these are people who have not treated the president, but many of them have presided over the treatment of hundreds, if not more, COVID-19 patients. So first, Conley, the president's Dr. Spin, said there's been nothing of any major clinical concern. His cardiac, liver, and kidney function demonstrates continued normal findings or improving findings. And he's made statements like that, okay? So first it was continued normal, and then they are improving. Improving from what? What was, falling below standards? His blood oxygen level, for example? So here's Robert Wachter from University of California, San Francisco's Department of Medicine. He's the chair. He said, for someone sick enough to have required remdesivir and dexamethasone, I can't think of a situation in which a patient would be okay to leave on day 3, even with the White House's medical capacity. And over at Vanderbilt, Professor of Infectious Diseases William Schaffner, absolutely not. I will bet dollars to donuts it's the president and his political aides who are talking about discharge, not his doctors. Medical consensus says that some patients who seem relatively healthy suddenly deteriorate, either because of the virus itself or excessive immune response that can cause damage to several organs, including the heart. Trump is described as 74, male, overweight, a mild heart condition. And here's the list of medications that he is currently on. Monoclonal antibodies, and we'll give you a little detail on that in a moment. Dexamethasone, a steroid found to help patients with advanced respiratory distress. He's taking vitamin D and zinc, an over-the-counter drug called famotidine, the active ingredient in heartburn medication Pepcid. And he has previously touted the benefits of zinc in combination with HCQ, hydroxychloroquine, but explicitly they are not feeding him HCQ at Walter Reed. So we have a quote here from Dr. Walensky at Massachusetts General. All of these are data-free zones. We just don't know. Especially the use of a steroid usually reserved for patients whose immune systems are over-functioning. That is inconsistent with the characterization by Trump's physicians that he is getting better. So this is part of all of the confusion that's been generated, perhaps intentionally, by Trump and his staff. And it just exacerbates the problem that began late Thursday night and festered into Friday, where there are many people who sincerely believe that he is faking this whole episode. And as I said on Friday, and I still feel this way, I don't think he's faking. I think he's faking that he is recovering faster than any human who has done so to date. But I do understand why people suspect that, because they have been lied to so frequently and so brazenly by this man and his underlings. So we get a lot of blue sky from Trump, from Dr. Conley. And here's the quote from Trump. It's been a very interesting journey. I learned a lot about COVID. I learned it by really going to school. This is the real school. This isn't the let's read the books school. And I get it, and I understand it. And it's a very interesting thing, and I'm going to be letting you know about it. But first, I'm going to ignore what I just said and hop in a limo and ride around to wave at some fans to feed my greatest need and to offset my deep insecurities. He also mentioned in that video that was tweeted out that he had met some soldiers while he's at Walter Reed. Well, he should be completely isolated. And the idea that he's, wandering the halls and popping in on sick or recovering members of the services, that is just bizarre. So here comes James Phillips, an attending physician at Walter Reed. Every single person in the vehicle, referring to the agents, during that completely unnecessary presidential drive-by just now, has to be quarantined for 14 days. They might get sick, they might die, for political theater, commanded by Trump to put their lives at risk for theater. This is insanity. And in a phone interview, Phillips went on, at what point does the physician-patient relationship end? And does the commander-in-chief and subordinate relationship begin? And were those doctors ordered to allow this to happen? Noting that it violated standards of care and would not be an option open to any other patient. When I first saw this, I thought maybe he was being transported to another hospital. So this is just more of the same. And I hasten to repeat what I've been saying for weeks now. We have not reached bottom. No, you must brace yourselves for more cringeworthy behavior from this president, more disingenuous commentary from Trump and his allies, because they're going to do everything they can to wish this away. And let's say, Trump follows through, and at this moment he's on his way back to the White House. What's he going to do there? Who's going to be willing to sit in the same room with the man who has the best-known case of COVID-19 in the world? I don't care if you put on masks and you put up plexiglass and everybody wears PPE. I just think it is bizarre. And I'm sure you do too. And it's also just so galling to see this tax cheat. We have the proof. Just a week ago, the New York Times produced the documents, his tax returns and other financial records, showing that this guy doesn't pay taxes. Yet he is being given double gold, triple platinum health care, access to experimental medications, no expense being spared. And this is the guy who hasn't paid taxes. Even when he paid taxes, he found ways to finagle refunds. And so when you really are honest, objective, you cut through all of the bullshit, it still remains stunning that so many people continue to support this idiot. Rush Limbaugh, I could only stand about 5 minutes this morning. He was accusing liberals of hating Trump and all of us, referring to conservatives, so much that people were being mean to Kayleigh McEnany. And this is just so much more projection, because I believe the Democrats aren't mean enough. And I heard too many of them with these politically correct statements of thoughts and prayers for the president. And of course, we want him to recover. We do. Now, I do draw the line at wishing that someone would die. But I don't criticize others who feel that way and express it in this moment. But I don't wish for his recovery, or not a quick recovery. I hope this is what finally separates him from at least enough of his cult followers that he loses on November 3rd. And as I said, to see him get this, top of the line, best available in the world treatment, and we are paying for it. This guy claims to be so frickin' wealthy, but he's too cheap to contribute to the U.S. Treasury, even when it directly benefits him. So one of the things that he has been given is an what is it here? A monoclonal antibodies treatment. And this is being developed in part by Regeneron. That is a San Francisco-based pharmaceutical research firm. The way it works, these are lab-made clones of the antibodies produced naturally in people who've recovered from COVID-19. The antibodies bind to the virus's spike protein, block its ability to enter cells, allowing the immune system to clear the body of the virus. The medicine is best used for people in early or less severe stages of the disease because it essentially gives somebody antibodies that their own immune system would develop later. And what I'm not qualified to answer, but I'm at least qualified to ask, is with all these different drugs, we don't really know how they work together. And the steroids are supposed to be for later stages of people with more serious infections. The remdesivir is supposed to be for early stages. But what happens when you mash all that up with the monoclonal antibodies that are untested? Well, I guess Trump is the guinea pig. So this is a mind-boggling episode that we weren't prepared for. And to see this guy, Sean Conley, out there, I mean, he's a little bit more credible than Dr. Randy Jackson and that New York doctor with the long hair that Trump dictated his investigative findings to. And here's the Fauci quote. Personally, I've not been involved in the direct care of the president, but I might comment that my colleagues that I know, including Sean Conley, are very good physicians. They're very qualified. So I'm really confident that the president is getting the optimal care that you can get with the team over at Walter Reed. Okay. I don't share that confidence. And I'm not trying to demean osteopaths. But it would seem that an infectious disease expert would be best positioned to manage the president's care and also to be the public mouthpiece. So, I've read you the quote about Trump has learned a lot. No, he hasn't. Now on to a couple of quick tidbits from the latest Ipsos poll. 2/3 of Americans believe Trump would not be sick if he had taken COVID-19 more seriously. And 38% of Americans are either unsure of what to believe around Trump's diagnosis or don't believe that he has COVID-19. And as I mentioned Friday, I'm glad to see skepticism in the American public. In my own case, I don't see that it fits this situation with the information that we have so far. We are learning who the 3 reporters were who were at the investiture of Amy COVID Barrett a week ago Saturday at the White House. One is New York Times reporter Michael D. Shear. And he said, nobody from the White House has said boo and asked anything about where I was or who I talked to or who else I might have infected. So I think it just shows that they're not taking it seriously, at least as it pertains to themselves. The second reporter was photojournalist Al Drago, and I don't know the third so far. And here is the current list of those in the cluster, the super spreader Supreme Court cluster. And it does appear that Rose Garden event was a spreading zone. Also, the rehearsals for Trump's 100-plus interruptions in Tuesday night's debate, because Chris Christie checked himself into a hospital. He and Kellyanne Conway were the primary people who were doing debate prep with Trump. Conway's 15-year-old daughter, who had said she was running away and calling for her emancipation, and that's what prompted Kellyanne to say she was leaving the White House, but clearly she hasn't. The daughter is now positive with COVID. Also, one anomaly, this has surfaced in a report I read in Saturday's Los Angeles Times. Melania Trump reportedly tested positive in Cleveland before the debate on Tuesday night. Now, we don't know the sequence of timing. We've heard that Trump arrived late and he took a pass on being tested at that point. Some comments were made by somebody about the honor system, and you can't ever say that around Trump. But we do need to know more about Melania's timeline. And if they notified her at the debate that she was positive, because afterward I didn't see her kiss the old man, but she went up and was standing very close to him on the debate stage. So you know about Hope Hicks, Kaylee, Senator Mike Lee of Utah, Tom Tillis of North Carolina, Ron Johnson of Wisconsin, who was not at the Supreme Court unveiling. Ronna McDaniel, the RNC chair. Also, I had believed that she was at the Supreme Court event, but apparently not. The president of Notre Dame, Father John Jenkins. Campaign manager Bill Stepien. We don't have a clear idea of when he may have been infected. And Trump's personal assistant, bagman Nick Luna. So there's so many people who were in close proximity to Trump, not wearing masks, that it appears he is the spreader. And Hope Hicks may be being blamed for being the vector who reached POTUS. But that is still an open question. New Jersey Governor Phil Murphy, a Democrat, has chastised Trump for holding that fundraiser at his golf club in New Jersey last Thursday night with all the fat cats. Murphy tweeted, "The president and his staff acted recklessly in coming to New Jersey knowing that they had been exposed to someone with a confirmed positive test. We hope that no confirmed cases come out of the event in Bedminster. This is a matter of humanity, but also of leadership by example." Mike Pence, it's reported, continues to test negative. He's leaving for Utah today, apparently before Trump, if he does, returns to the White House. He is getting set to visit that hotspot where he is scheduled to debate Kamala Harris, his vice presidential opponent, on Wednesday. So I mentioned the tweets that Trump fired off this morning. They're all in all caps, and it does suggest that the steroids got him all hopped up. His tweets were often very short bursts, things like massive regulation cuts, vote, pro-life, vote, save our Second Amendment, vote, Space Force, vote, corrupt fake news media, vote. So here is the report on Don Jr. This is from Vanity Fair, available online today. And let's give credit. Gabriel Sherman is the reporter breaking this story. But according to sources, Little Don has told friends that he tried lobbying Ivanka, Eric, and Jared to convince the president that he needs to stop acting unstable. Don Jr. says he wants to stage an intervention, but Jared and Ivanka keep telling Trump how great he's doing. Don Jr. is said to be reluctant to confront his father alone, saying, "I'm not going to be the only one to tell him he's acting crazy." And it is a fact that steroids affect mood, causing euphoria or a general happiness. And get this. Again, I credit Gabriel, what's his last name? Gabriel Sherman, because he references that Trump's father, Fred Sr., developed dementia, Alzheimer's, but he refused to retire. He said to retire is to expire. So every day they set up an office to make it look like Fred was still running the Trump organization. He would go there in Brooklyn. They would give him blank papers to sort through and sign. The phone on his desk was set up so that it could only reach his secretary. Well, what did Trump do on Saturday? He sat for two separate photo ops about 10 minutes apart, one where he had a jacket on, one where he didn't, and he signed blank pieces of paper. I mean, does he just want to be like his daddy? And is he that desperate? And I want to thank Linda Lewis, who's taking a little time off from helping me here with the podcast. And she wrote, "If you've been reading my Facebook page, you've seen my observation that both times Trump went on an emergency basis to Walter Reed, it was after he appeared to go off the deep end. Last year, it was during the impeachment hearings when he sent out tweets that sounded like witness intimidation. This time, it was after his bizarre debate performance. I've been wondering if erratic behavior more than COVID was what led people to direct Trump to the hospital. She said that's still conjecture, but apparently some people around Trump are having the kind of concerns that I surmised. Well, the Supreme Court is back in session, starting a new term and waiting for the ninth seat to be filled. And so far, they dismissed a case related to the county clerk from Kentucky who claimed that her religious freedom was violated because she refused to issue marriage licenses to same-sex couples. So they let a lower court ruling stand in that case. They have acknowledged that they're taking on a climate change case and a voting rights case, but that's about all we know so far. So will the Republicans continue the what I call the death march to install Amy Barrett to replace Ruth Ginsburg? And will this coronavirus outbreak that has already infected 3 Republican senators, 2 of whom sit on the Judiciary Committee, will this delay the process? Oh, no, say Mitch McConnell and Judiciary Chairman Lindsey Graham. Lindsey, we're going to have a hearing for Amy Barrett. It'll be done safely, but I've got a job to do, and I'm pressing on. But they may run into roadblocks where unless they can change the Senate rules to allow senators to vote remotely, which currently is not an option, that they may not be able to get this out of committee, having lost 2 senators. And the Republicans have 12 seats, the Democrats have 10. So that would make it a deadlock. Now that technically, if you follow the rules, would kill the nomination. But we have seen in the past that McConnell will bring to the floor a nomination that has been deadlocked in committee. And in the past, he's gotten away with it. Can he do that with a Supreme Court nominee? We don't know. And, of course, if they hold the hearing, more senators could become infected. And we have to guess that Amy Coney Barrett, who reports that she had a bout of COVID this summer and is past it. We have no details on whether she was seriously infected or just tested positive. But do we really want to test whether she can be reinfected? Well, the Republicans seem hell-bent. And David Sirota, in his newsletter, The Daily Poster, put out the word yesterday that Democrats today could take an action that could have a serious impact. And it relates to Mitch McConnell's call to adjourn the Senate until October 19th. Now, the Democrats have a reasonable basis not to agree to an adjournment because there is still hope for a COVID relief bill. And if the adjournment occurs, that is not possible before October 19th. So McConnell wants to shut down the Senate floor but keep the Judiciary Committee open to proceed with the Barrett confirmation process. And Sirota writes, if Democrats deny McConnell unanimous consent, vulnerable GOP senators in key battleground states may have to leave the campaign trail because Republicans would need every vote they have since 3 of them are out with COVID. And if Democrats are able to vote down McConnell's adjournment resolution, they can use their leverage to demand an adjournment resolution that defers the Supreme Court confirmation hearings and moves forward a pandemic relief package. But will they? I would rather go buy a lottery ticket and take my chances there than bet the same money on Democratic opposition strategy. And I want to recommend a good piece, I've linked to it, written by Chris Hedges, which analyzes the nomination of Amy Barrett. And echoing the comments you may have heard in my in-depth interview last week with Professor Janet Jacobson, the surface opposition to Barrett revolves around her opposition to Obamacare and to abortion rights. But Hedges writes, the Christian right does not want examined her abject subservience to corporate power, her hostility to workers, civil liberties, unions, and environmental regulations. Capitalism in the hands of Christian fascists has become sacralized in the form of the prosperity gospel, says Hedges, the belief that Jesus came to minister to our material needs, blessing believers with wealth and power. The prosperity gospel delights the corporations that have carried out the slow-motion corporate coup. This is why big companies like Tyson Foods, which places Christian right chaplains in its plants, Purdue, Walmart, Sam's, along with many other corporations, pour money into the movement, and institutions like Liberty University and the Patrick Henry Law School. Barrett has ruled consistently in favor of corporations, Hedges says, to cheat gig workers out of overtime, greenlight fossil fuel extraction and pollution, and strip consumers of protection from corporate fraud. The watchdog group Accountable.us found that as a circuit court judge, Barrett faced at least 55 cases in which citizens took on corporate entities, and 76% of the time, she sided with the corporations. There's more to the piece. Follow the links. It's published at SheerPost, at Mint Press News, and I picked it up from consortiumnews.com. Every day I pause for a minute to thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. People like Janet Price, Brian Mazzy, Ted Kelly, and Terry Paris. They all chip in a few dollars a month to help support the podcast. And while I will be winding down after the election, you're free to support me in the meantime. Just visit peterbcollins.com/sign up. Well, Tulsi Gabbard has teamed up with the renegade Republican Tom Massie of Kentucky. They're co-sponsoring legislation in support of Julian Assange. The press release sounds like this. Gabbard and Massie introduced H-Res 1175, defending freedom of the press, noting that news-gathering activities and news organizations' ability to acquire and publish information are protected under the First Amendment. The resolution calls for the United States to drop all charges and efforts to extradite Julian Assange. A quote from Gabbard, "Freedom of the press is a vital function of a free democracy in which the government is accountable to the people. Assange published information that exposed lies and abuses of power at the highest levels of our government. His indictment under the Espionage Act sends a chilling message to every member of the media and all Americans." And Gabbard continued, U.S. government prosecutors now claim that any journalist or news organization that publishes classified material is liable to prosecution under the Espionage Act, which would have led to the indictment of the Washington Post for publication of the Pentagon Papers. The federal government's prosecution of Assange sets a dangerous precedent. All extradition efforts and charges under the Espionage Act against Julian Assange must be dropped now. Well, I fully support the Congresswoman on this matter. And Kevin Gosztola, with a follow-up report from the hearings into extradition that ended at the Old Bailey in London last week, that the FBI enlisted Ecuador government's help in seizing legally privileged materials after Julian Assange was arrested and booted from the Ecuador embassy in London last April 11th. According to one of Assange's attorneys, a woman named Gareth Pierce, she made immediate contact with the embassy in regard to legally privileged material, an issue of huge concern. Assange wanted the material, in addition to confidential medical data, identified and released to his lawyers. But her requests were repeatedly ignored, and we have learned that the information was grabbed by security teams under the control of the government of Ecuador and handed off to the U.S. government. So this is just another way that the U.S. has violated the rights of a suspect who is not an American, who is not in the United States. And the very idea that he is subject to the long arm of the law of the U.S., and then they can violate our rules of procedure and privacy is just disgusting. And Gordon Kromberg, who had these memos that were widely quoted in the extradition hearing, but he didn't testify and was not available for cross-examination. Well, he says that he set up a taint team that would excise material so it couldn't be used in any trial in the United States. But this has made the efforts of Assange's legal team more difficult because they don't have those documents, and the U.S. government does. So witness number one, a former employee of the Spanish security firm UC Global that had the dual contract with Ecuador and with Sheldon Adelson's Sands Casino security operation. Witness one told the court that his boss, David Morales, showed at times a real obsession in relation to monitoring and recording the lawyers who met with Assange because, quote, our American friends were requesting it. And this kind of surveillance or eavesdropping, recording of attorney-client meetings is fundamentally against the rules and the law here in the United States. But as as I said, the long arm of the law does not respond to those kinds of niceties. I want to recommend a piece that I found. I think somebody online recommended it to me, and it was published in Britain because no American media outlet would touch this. And it is based on the work of two North Carolina professors, Kevin Singer at North Carolina State and his colleague at the same university, Alyssa Rockenbach. And they have analyzed differences and similarities between moderate Democrats and conservative Republicans, and their findings are disturbing. Political researcher David Adler is cited, finding that across Europe and North America, centrists are the least supportive of democracy, the least committed to its institutions, and the most supportive of authoritarianism. And furthermore, Adler found that centrists are the least supportive of free and fair elections, as well as civil rights. In the U.S., only 25% of centrists agree that civil rights are an essential feature of democracy. And this is troubling because in some ways it validates what retired Berkeley professor George Lakoff has argued, that there is no real center, that there are people who hold moderate views on certain subjects and stronger views, more passionate views on others. And yes, when you put everybody on a continuum, some people show up as centrists. They're in the middle. But it doesn't mean that their political behavior is predictable in the same manner. So the authors here also cite a study of college seniors. And they ask them a series of questions, like, I am actively working to foster justice in the world. Well, only 57% of moderate women said yes to that statement, where 68% of liberal men and 74% of liberal women did. And the 57% for moderate women is just slightly higher than the 52% for conservative women. So I've linked to their report, and I encourage you to check it out. I think it is provocative. The voter suppression schemes of Republicans continue unabated, and as many as 100,000 or more voters in Iowa may be denied a mail-in ballot. There is a snag driven by legal machinations. And it has to do with the fact that the Iowa election officials pre-filled some of the fields for absentee ballot applications. But in one case, 64,000 ballot requests are likely to be invalidated by the courts, and in another case, a separate 100,000 are likely to be invalidated because voters in Iowa need a voter number. And I'd never heard of this before. I don't know that I have a voter number here in California, a voter identification number. And it appears a lot of Iowans didn't know they had one either because they returned the forms without it, and therefore they have been declared ineligible. The Campaign Legal Center, a nonpartisan watchdog, filed a complaint with the Federal Elections Commission, where nobody's home, accusing the Trump campaign of laundering $170 million through a number of companies, many of which were operated by Brad Parscale, who has just left the campaign after his skirmish with the police and accusations of heavy drinking and domestic violence at home in Florida. So the Trump campaign and Trump Make America Great Again committee disguised nearly $170 million of campaign spending by laundering the funds through different firms. The firms are headed by Parscale or created by Trump campaign lawyers. The complaint alleges that the campaign paid millions of dollars to campaign-connected vendors without reporting those payments to the FEC. And the cover story is they were trying to avoid paying commissions to media buyers, so they just cut out the middleman and went direct. But it appears that Brad Parscale may have lined his pockets in the process. We may never know because the Federal Elections Commission is completely toothless. It doesn't even have enough members for a quorum right now. And so it is completely neutered during this critical election cycle as billions of dollars are being showered on an already corrupt political process. I want to recommend a piece by Murtaza Hussain published at The Intercept today. He begins by talking about that Harper's Magazine letter that 150 public intellectuals signed on to, and they were denouncing cancel culture. And I do not embrace this letter, partly because some of the people who signed it cancel others. So he notes that there are people who agree with the opposition to cancel culture, including, for example, a pro-Palestinian activist whose name is Hammam Farah. He's a Palestinian Canadian born in Gaza and raised between the United Arab Emirates and Canada. And he was studying to be licensed as a therapist when he found out that he's on a blacklist. He said, people are against cancel culture. That's great. I'm also against it. But the most outrageous cases of people getting canceled are Palestinians and those who stand in solidarity with us. When it comes to Palestinians standing up for our own rights, it's very difficult. Our free speech and freedom of expression has been attacked over and over. And then Hussain shifts to coverage of Canary Mission. And this group was exposed in the Al Jazeera documentary called The Lobby. And they have created an online blacklist of people they view as anti-Semitic, anti-Israel, people who support BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanction aimed at Israel. And in this piece, Hussain does a good job of describing the impact on people who are on Canary Mission's blacklist. And it prevents them from getting jobs in the United States. It makes them targets for hate. And it does not have any government sanction. It's just been created by pro-Zionist people and is used to cancel those who don't agree with the politics of the State of Israel. In a victory for Venezuela, a British court has swung in favor of the government of Nicolas Maduro and against the would-be president, Juan Guaido. The Court of Appeal granted an appeal by Banco Central de Venezuela, and set aside July's High Court judgment, which had found that Britain's recognition of Guaido meant that the $1.8 billion worth of Venezuelan gold being stored at the Bank of England could be handed off to Guaido. And I want to encourage you to follow the links to Mint Press News for Alan McLeod's excellent article on this, which puts important context around this report. Let me quote this part. A nearly unheard-of politician before his ascension to the role of head of the Venezuelan National Assembly in 2019, January of 2019, Guaido shocked the country by using his appointment to unilaterally declare himself president. He then led a series of coup attempts throughout last year and this year, the last of which involved paying Trump-linked American mercenaries to shoot their way into the presidential palace. So I think it's important because the Guardian from London did report the decision by the court with none of the background and context that you get from the Mint Press report. Here's today's COVID-19 daily update for you. The report from over the weekend is that we now show almost 210,000 deaths in the United States linked to COVID-19, with 332 reported in the last 24 hours. In my earlier report and comments on President Trump and his COVID-19 episode, I mentioned that he, of course, had promoted the use of hydroxychloroquine with zinc as a treatment for COVID-19. And I think it's interesting because he appears to have voluntarily taken a 2-week course of HCQ back in May, or was it June? And he never said that it was going to make him immune or anything like that, and it's not clear why he took it. And, of course, we have to be skeptical of whether he actually did take it or if he just said he did. But over the weekend in social media, there are a lot of posts, including under the hashtag HCQWorks, with people suggesting that the president be put on a course of HCQ. And when you consider what else they're giving him, it doesn't seem unreasonable that he would say, hey, I want to try that HCQ. I've been telling everybody that it works. And as I have said, I initially kind of followed the official sources and said, well, it was given temporary approval by the FDA, and then they withdrew the approval, claiming that it doesn't work to speed recovery or prevent healthy people from contracting the coronavirus. FDA now says that HCQ can cause dangerous abnormalities in heart rhythm in coronavirus patients. I still don't understand how it doesn't cause those abnormalities for malaria patients, but it does for COVID patients. Anyway, I think it's interesting that Trump is willing to take experimental therapies, but was either talked out of or prevented from trying HCQ. 2 Democratic senators, and that would be Dick Durbin of Illinois and Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts, have written to Bill Barr, the Attorney General, suggesting that the government's response to coronavirus outbreaks in federal facilities, including prisons, is a failure. And they say that the policies of the Board of Prisons are inconsistently applied. They've been raising this since March, and they've been widely ignored. Prison overcrowding remains an issue in the federal system, and that leads to greater exposure. And here's a comment from a prisoner at the federal prison in Central Florida. We've officially been on quarantine lockdown since April 1, haven't been outdoors, despite CDC's recommendation to get as much fresh air as possible. The windows don't open, and there's no ventilation to filter in fresh air. And according to the letter from Durbin and Warren, the Board of Prisons has transferred only about 4% of its population to home confinement. And we have seen that 17,000 federal prisoners and staff members have tested positive, and more than 130 have died. In Europe, a cluster kind of similar to the Trump cluster here, 179 staff members of the European Commission tested positive for COVID-19 since the start of the pandemic, and currently the president of the EU is in quarantine. Bars in Paris will close for 2 weeks starting tomorrow as France tries to stem a surge of COVID cases in its capital. The measure will also affect most cafes, which in many cases serve alcohol but little or no food. Restaurants will be able to remain open. There has been a spike in certain areas, more than 250 cases per 100,000 in parts of Paris. More than 100 per 100,000 in some elderly communities, and more than one-third of intensive care beds are occupied by COVID patients right now. Governor Cuomo of New York said today that schools will be closed in certain hotspot zip codes in New York City. Quote, "I'm not going to recommend or allow any New York City family to send their child to a school that I wouldn't send my child to." Mayor de Blasio announced an emergency crackdown, saying that he intended to impose new restrictions on schools and businesses in 20 hotspots in Brooklyn and Queens. Utah recorded 1,387 new cases yesterday. That's its single-day record. And as I mentioned, that is where the vice presidential debate is scheduled for later this week. The other hotspots currently, Wisconsin, Indiana, Montana, and Wyoming. I'm pleased to report that in Venice, high tides hit over the weekend, but the new tide or flood control system actually worked. They had a tide that peaked at 49 inches, which would normally inundate more than a third of the city of canals. But reportedly, none of them overflowed over the weekend. Interesting piece in today's Washington Post profiling one of the right-wing armed groups that doesn't get as much attention. And this is the Oath Keepers, a heavily armed civilian group that's guarded private businesses during racial demonstrations this year. And the group is kind of off the radar. They've been active in Louisville. They were confronted by a group of protesters led by 34-year-old Chris Will, who said, "Why didn't every single one of you motherfuckers put this shit on to come help Breonna Taylor when they killed her?" So he was really getting in their faces. And the Oath Keepers praised the Kenosha, Wisconsin teenage shooter, Kyle, a lead shooter, because Black Lives Matter protests are well-funded Marxist and racist agitators in their view. So I think it's worth reading so that you're aware that just like the Proud Boys and the Three Percenters and Atomwaffen, you have an idea of the array of these violent, or at least violence-prone, right-wing groups. And finally today, speaking of the Proud Boys, George Takei mused online last week. I wonder if people, what is the BTS? I don't know what it is. Okay, I'll just read it to you. I wonder if the BTs and TikTok kids can help LGBTs with this. Okay, I guess it's bisexual and transgender. What if gay guys took pictures of themselves making out with each other or doing very gay things, then tagged themselves with hashtag Proud Boys? I bet that would mess them up real bad. And then his hashtag was reclaiming my shine. So it has taken on a viral nature. Bobby Burke, star of Queer Eye, tweeted a picture of himself with his husband. Look at these cute little Proud Boys. Then John Cooper, former chair of the Democratic Coalition, former campaign chair for Obama, shared a picture of himself and his husband and children. My husband Rob and I are two proud boys. Here we are with our 5 wonderful children. I like that. I think that's clever. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. You're free to share all over the place. You'll find it on YouTube. And I remain Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling.